Hello, welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration public meeting for the Draft Air Tour Management Plan for Everglades National Park. I'm Michelle Carter, an Environmental Protection Specialist with the National Park Service, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. I'm going to start off by defining a couple of acronyms you'll hear us use. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as FAA, and the Air Tour Management Plans as ATMPs. We'll define the remaining acronyms as we go along the presentation. Next slide, please. We're holding this virtual public meeting to review the draft ATMP and to seek public feedback on this draft. This meeting is being held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, also known as NPATMA, and its implementing regulations. You're going to hear a little bit more about NPATMA and the draft ATMP shortly, along with information on how you can submit comments and questions. But before we dive into the presentations, I'd like to take a minute to introduce our speakers and provide you with a little bit more information about the meeting logistics and how you can participate. Next slide, please. So joining us this evening as presenters are Keith Lusk, a program manager and special program staff with the Western Pacific region of FAA. From the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service, we have Vicki Ward, Overflights Program Manager, and Adam Becko, a social scientist and also Overflights Program Manager. And from Everglades National Park, we have the Park Deputy Superintendent, Sabrina Diaz. Keith and Vicki are going to give us a brief overview of NPATMA and the purpose of today's meeting. And then we'll hear from Deputy Superintendent Diaz and Adam, who will share perspective from the park's perspective and talk a little bit more about park-specific resources and the draft ATMP. Next slide, please. So throughout the meeting, we invite you to submit questions, which will be addressed after the presentations as part of our final Q&A session. The questions that are submitted through this evening's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they develop the draft ATMPs, but they're not actually considered formal comments. Next slide, please. All official comments must be submitted through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment site, or as we call it, PEPC, or they need to be sent to the mailing address listed on the Parks PEPC site. These formal comments will become part of the official record, and I'll share more information about this later in the presentation. I'd also like to point out that these formal comments must be received by August 28th of this year. Next slide, please. So this meeting tonight is being live streamed across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. If you're watching on one of these platforms, you can submit your questions using the link to the Google form the FAA is going to post in the chat area of whatever platform you're using. And we'll end up reading your questions aloud after they come in and we have a chance to process them, and our presenters will then respond. Our team is going to do the best that we can do to get to all of the questions, but in the event that we don't get to your question, we will provide contact information at the end where you can go for post-meeting follow-up. The whole meeting will be 90 minutes long. And we plan to adjourn at 8 p.m. Eastern time. And if we get through all of the questions early, our goal is to try to keep the meeting active until 8 p.m. in case additional questions end up coming in. And please note, this meeting will be recorded. We appreciate you joining us this evening to learn more about Everglades draft ATMP. We'll now play a short video before I turn it over to Eric and Vicki to provide additional details about NPATMA and why we're here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as air tour management plans. And today, we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft air tour management plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on your location. My name is Keith Lusk. I'm a program manager with the Federal Aviation Administration, and I'm here with my National Park Service colleague, Vicki Ward, to provide you with a little background information and context regarding the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, as well as air tour management plans in general. Next slide, please. The National Parks Air Tour Management Act was enacted in April of 2000 with subsequent amendment provisions added in 2012. In terms of a high-level general overview of what NAPATMA is it's a law that requires the FAA in cooperation with the Park Service to develop air tour management plans for those parks and tribal lands where operators have applied to conduct commercial air tours. It's important to note what ATMPs apply to and what they do not apply to. They apply to specifically commercial air tour operations which fly over a national park unit or within a half-mile boundary of that park. Also over tribal lands within or abutting that park. And also in terms of altitude, the commercial air tour operations that are subject to this act are air tours that are conducted from ground level to 5,000 feet above ground level while they're in that airspace. Next slide, please. As noted, air tour management plans only encompass commercial air tour operations over national parks. They do not apply to general aviation activity, any regularly scheduled commercial airline activity, or military flights. They also do not apply to any air tour activity in any of the Alaska parks. That was specifically exempted in the original legislation. It also does not cover any air tours that are conducted over Grand Canyon National Park. As many of you know, there's quite a few commercial air tour operations over Grand Canyon National Park. Those are overseen and regulated through separate legislation. It also does not apply to Rocky Mountain National Park, where the original legislation expressly prohibited commercial air tours from being conducted. Parks, as part of the 2012 amendment provisions to the original legislation, parks with 50 or fewer annual air tour operations were exempt from having to develop an air tour management plan, specifically unless there was an exemption which was withdrawn by the Park Service. There's approximately 50 to 55 national park units that qualify for this exemption. Currently, Everglades is not one of them. They do have air tour operations exceeding 50 annually right now. But an air tour management plan, which we're in the process of developing right now, can come up with any number of air tours to be authorized under that plan. Also of note, if abutting tribal lands are or may be overflown, tribes will be invited as a cooperating agency for purposes of compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act. We'll speak a little bit more about the National Environmental Policy Act in later slides. Next slide, please. The legislation makes two distinctions between two types of air tour operators. commercial air tour operators needed to apply to the FAA for what is called operating authority in order to conduct these tours over the national park units or abutting tribal lands. They did this back in the early 2002-2003 timeframe, and upon their application, the FAA granted them with what was called interim operating authority. And that was based on the number of flights that they had conducted in the year or the 3 previous years prior to enactment of the act. So in the years before the year 2000, when NEPATMA came into effect, that became the basis or baseline for interim operating authority that was granted to these air tour operators. They can continue to do those numbers, up to those numbers annually at those parks until such time as the agencies developed an air tour management plan. The 2 types of operators are existing commercial air tour operators. Those were the ones that were flying actively over these parks before the year 2000, before the act came into effect, and then new entrant commercial air tour operators. New entrants, as you could probably figure out, are those that applied to the FAA after the act came into effect in 2000. So there are provisions if a new entrant wants to come in and apply to conduct tours over the park. There's a provision and a process that they submit an application to both of the agencies who review at the park from a resource protection standpoint and the FAA from an aviation safety standpoint. Next slide, please. And I think I'll be turning it over to Vicki.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I'm Vicki Ward. I'm from the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division in the National Park Service, and I'll continue the overview of NEPATMA. For the air tour management plans that are being developed, they all have the same objective, and that is to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts, if any, resulting from commercial air tour operations upon natural and cultural resources, visitor experiences, and tribal lands. And this is a provision that is straight out of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. Next slide. In putting together an air tour management plan, there are some specific things that are required and some that are in there as desirable to prevent impacts to park resources. So an air tour management plan may prohibit commercial air tour operations in whole or in part. It may establish conditions for the conduct of air tour operations, such as the routes, minimum altitudes, time of day restrictions, such as operating hours for the day, restrictions for particular events. If there's something going on at a park that can be noted as a no-fly day, or just to avoid a certain area. The air tour management plan can also specify the maximum number of flights on an annual, a seasonal, or a yearly basis. It applies to all commercial air tour operations within 1.5 miles outside the boundary of the national park, and it must include incentives for the adoption of quiet aircraft technology. Those are aircraft that are quieter generally than the typical helicopters, or perhaps for fixed wing aircraft on a per passenger basis. The air tour management plan also must provide for the allocations for the air tour operations when the air tour management plan limits the number of air operations. And each air tour management plan includes a section that documents the need for the measures taken, such as the routes, the altitudes, and the time of day restrictions, and the maximum number of flights. Those are justifications are included in the air tour management plan, and those are also included in the record of decision document at the conclusion of the air tour management planning process. Next slide. And for those folks who might be calling in on the phone, this is a slide showing a picture of the United States and the location of other parks where we are developing air tour management plans. We are working on air tour management plans for 24 parks concurrently. They tend to be clustered in the western half of the United States. So Washington, there's a couple in Washington that we're doing. San Francisco Bay Area, Death Valley, another group in southern Utah, and then 2 parks in Hawaii. We're also doing air tour management plans for Glacier National Park, Badlands and Mount Rushmore. And then for the Southeast United States, today, obviously, we're here to talk about the air tour management plan for Everglades, but is also an air tour management plan in the works for Great Smokies National Park and for the New York area harbor parks. Next slide. So for each air tour management plan, we are holding a public meeting to get feedback on the proposed air tour management plan, which was published in the Federal Register at the beginning of, at the end of August. We are holding this public meeting to inform the development of this air tour management plan. We will also be complying with the National Environmental Policy Act and other legal requirements, such as the National Historic Preservation Act and the Endangered Species Act. We will also invite tribes to participate as cooperating agencies for NEPA compliance in cases where tribal lands are or may be overflown. So for today's meeting, we will be going over the components of the draft air tour management plan for folks to ask questions about that and to provide public comment on that. So with that, I think I am now turning it back over to Michelle.
Yes, thanks, Vicki. So thanks both to Vicki and Keith for all of that information. And now I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Superintendent Diaz and Adam Becca for a little bit more information from the parks perspective.
Hi, good evening, everybody. And thanks, Michelle, for facilitating the meeting. And a big thank you to Keith and Vicki for those overviews. I'd like to start by thanking all the community members and park stakeholders that are on the call tonight for taking time to join us. My name is Sabrina Diaz. I'm the Deputy Superintendent here at Everglades and Dry Tortugas National Parks. And I want to welcome you to this virtual public meeting for Everglades National Park Air Tour Management Plan. I've been in this new assignment for just under 6 months. However, I've had the privilege of working in the Everglades several times over my 20-year career with the National Park Service. Some of you may be familiar with Superintendent Pedro Ramos. He is disappointed that he's unable to be here tonight. However, he does send his regards and his sincere appreciation to all of you who are participating in this evening's call. I want to reiterate that one of the main purposes of this evening's meeting is to hear from you and to respond to any questions you may have on the proposed air tour management plan for Everglades. Your input is very important to us, and we are truly looking forward to hearing from each of you. Commercial air tours over Everglades National Park have been ongoing since before the National Park Service Air Tour Management Act was enacted in 2000. This project provides an opportunity for the National Park Service, in collaboration with the FAA, to set the terms and conditions for commercial air tours conducted over the park in accordance with the National Parks Tour Air Management Act. Everglades is truly a unique and special place. As the first national park designated for the protection of biological resources, Everglades National Park is the only place in the United States jointly designated as an international biosphere reserve, a World Heritage Site, and a wetland of international importance. These are very special resources here, and I want to highlight some of them tonight. Nearly 97% of Everglades National Park is designated as wilderness. The park contains the largest subtropical wilderness area in North America and the largest legislated wilderness area east of the Rocky Mountains. The park's legislated wilderness is known as the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Wilderness Area. The park contains a vast and hydrologically connected ecosystem with wetland sloughs and prairies, tropical hardwood hammocks, pine rocklands, extensive mangrove estuaries, and Florida Bay with its expansive seagrass meadows. These diverse habitats support a mix of tropical and temperate plants and animals, including iconic species such as the ghost orchid, Florida panther, American alligator, roseate spoonbill, small-toothed sawfish, wood stork, and the tarpon. The diverse habitats of the park offer visitors a wide range of activities, including canoeing, kayaking, boating, fresh and saltwater fishing, biking, hiking, unparalleled wildlife and bird viewing, photography, astronomy, and camping in the expansive wilderness. Additionally, visitors to the park have the opportunity to enjoy a relatively undeveloped and wild landscape, all within a stone's throw of the bustling Miami metropolitan area. Additionally, visitors value the park for its quiet and peaceful terrain and the prospect of finding solitude among the mangroves or in the river of grass. The park welcomes approximately 1 million people from all over the world each year. Here, visitors have the opportunity to commune with nature on a fundamental level. The planning process associated with the Air Tour Management Plan recognizes that the airspace over Everglades National Park is special and deserves to be managed differently, which is why we are doing a plan specifically for the park. The plan is designated to protect park resources and visitor experience from the effects of commercial air tours. We're excited to share the proposed plan for Everglades National Park with you, and we look forward to your input. With that, I'll turn it over back to Michelle, our facilitator. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sabrina. And now we'll turn it over to Adam for additional information from the park's perspective.
Thanks, Deputy Superintendent Diaz, for that wonderful introduction to the park. Again, my name is Adam Bico, and I work with the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division, based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. And I'd also like to thank everyone for attending tonight's meeting and just reiterate that we welcome your comments and questions about this draft ATMP. Next slide, please. So Superintendent Diaz gave a wonderful park overview and introduction to the park and the resources at the park. But just to reiterate a little bit here, the park does encompass 1.5 million acres in southern Florida. And the park also preserves the largest subtropical wilderness in the nation. And since Superintendent Diaz did such a good job, I'll just go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So just to orient you to the park really quickly, currently we're displaying a map. So for those of you on the phones, you may not be able to see it, but if you look to the northwest corner of the park, you'll see the Gulf Coast Visitor Center. This is also near the location of the Everglades Airport. This is the airport where all the air tours currently use for takeoff and landing. You'll also notice the green hash marks across the park. This represents all the designated wilderness inside of the park. You also see the purple hash marks across the park. This represents other wilderness categories, including potential and proposed wilderness. It is NPS policy to manage other wilderness categories the same as designated wilderness. And together, as mentioned earlier, this wilderness represents 97% of the park. You'll also see the location of 3 other visitor centers in the park, including Shark Valley Visitor Center, Ernest Cove Visitor Center, and the Flamingo Visitor Center. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to briefly discuss some of the park resources that are being considered in the ATMP process. First, I want to acknowledge the long human history of the area that we now call Everglades National Park. Native American tribes have used these lands for centuries. Specifically, I want to mention the reserve lands for the Mississippi tribe of the Indians of Florida within the park, as well as the tribal use by the Mississippi and the Seminole tribe of Florida. Other tribes also attach religious or cultural significance to the lands within the parks. In addition, the park is a landscape filled with various types of cultural resources, including archaeological sites, historic buildings, historic districts, and Native American sensitive sites. Tribes associated with Everglades, as well as other parties, are also being consulted through the Section 106 National Historic Preservation Act process. As mentioned earlier, 97% of the park is managed to preserve wilderness character. Wilderness is an important resource at Everglades National Park. The park also protects an unparalleled landscape that provides important habitat for numerous sensitive and or endangered species like the Florida manatee, American crocodile, Florida panther, and the wood stork. Nesting birds have been and will continue to be an important consideration as part of the AT&P process. The NPS and the FAA are currently working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with respect to how the AT&P might impact threatened or endangered species at the park. The acoustic environment of the park is also considered a natural resource in and of itself, as well as a resource that influences the wildlife habitat, visitor experience, cultural resources, wilderness character, and opportunities for interpretive programs. As Superintendent Diaz mentioned just earlier, for those of you who might be aware, the park averages around 1 million visitors a year, with the visitation generally highest for December through April. Visitor points of interest include front country and wilderness campgrounds, 4 visitor centers, and numerous trails. Education and interpretive programs occur across the park, primarily at developed areas such as the visitors. Next slide, please. Air tours at Everglades National Park have been ongoing since the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. An operator's IOA is based on the number of tours it was conducted that have been conducted annually at the time the act was passed, as Keith mentioned in his introduction. Currently at Everglades National Park, one air tour operator currently holds IOA for a total of 674 flights. However, the 3-year average based off of the reporting data from 2017 to 2019 is 64 flights conducted. There are no designated parameters on the route, time of day, or altitude restrictions. There's also no procedures for establishing any no-fly periods, and there are no training or educational requirements associated with this IOA. Next slide, please. So for the draft AT&P at the park, what you're looking at now is a table, and it compares the existing air tour conditions, which I just reviewed, against the draft AT&P and the proposal. So if we look at the number of air tours authorized per year, currently the IOA is 674, but the average is 64 flights per year. Under the draft AT&P, there would be 64 tours allowed annually. With respect to altitudes, on the second line of the table, currently there are no restrictions, but the operator reports flying at altitudes between 500 feet and 1,000 feet AGL, and AGL is above ground level. So that is how high the operator is flying above the ground. The draft AT&P proposes that the operator will fly no lower than 1,050 feet mean sea level, and mean sea level is the average sea level. For Everglades, there's not a lot of difference between the above ground level and the sea level because so much of the park is right at sea level. So the aircraft types. Currently, under the existing air tour conditions, there are no restrictions on aircraft type, but the operator is flying a fixed wing aircraft. Under the draft AT&P, only fixed wing aircraft will be allowed. Time of day and restrictions. Currently, there are no restrictions, but the operator is reporting that air tours are occurring between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. local time. Under that draft AT&P, air tours will not be allowed within 1 hour of sunrise or 1 hour after sunset. So, however, there is the quiet technologies that Vicki mentioned in her introduction. And if the operator does equip his aircraft with quiet technology, they will be allowed to fly from sunrise to sunset. They have week restrictions. Currently, under the existing condition, there are no restrictions. Under the draft AT&P, the Park Service can establish temporary no-fly periods for special events or planned park management activities. And finally, on the last line of the table, the required reporting and any additional requirements. Under the existing condition, the operator is required to do semi-annual reporting. However, under the draft AT&P, we will continue the requirement for semi-annual reporting, as well as when made available by park staff, operators and pilots may take one training course per year conducted by the Park Service, and at the request of either of the agencies, the park, the local FAA Flight Standards District Office, and the operator may meet once per year to discuss the implementation of this draft AT&P and any amendments for other changes to the ATMP. And then finally, for situational awareness, when conducting air tours over the park, the operator will utilize a certain frequency for communications. Next slide, please. So now, for those on the phone who can't see, we're displaying another map. This is the same map we displayed earlier that shows the park boundary and the wilderness, as well as the current and proposed routes associated with the air tour management plan. So the proposed commercial air tours authorized under this draft ATMP would be conducted on the routes shown on this slide. There are current routes already flown. These are all current routes already flown at the park. I will point out one thing. Up in the northwestern corner of the park, you'll see a green route that is known as the 10,000 Islands Tour. That is the most common route that is flown currently by the operator. And I will give you a minute to digest this map because there is a lot going on. As you can see, all of the air tours depart from the Everglades Airport that is in the northwest corner of the park. All right, next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, the provisions and conditions of this ATMP are designed to protect park resources and visitor experience from the effects of commercial air tours and support the NPS management objectives for the park. Under the National Park Air Tour Management Act, the FAA granted interim operating authority, IOA, for air tours over the park. The IOA does not provide any operating conditions for air tours other than that annual limit that I mentioned earlier. For the draft ATMP, the total number of air tours authorized under this ATMP is consistent with the existing air tours reported over the park. The annual flight limits in this ATMP are intended to protect the soundscapes, visitor experience, wilderness character, wildlife, and other park resources by limiting the total number of disturbances caused by commercial air tours. The condition that commercial air tours may fly no lower than 1,050 feet mean sea level under this ATMP is intended to protect bald eagles from the impacts of commercial air tours and is consistent with the National Bald Eagle Management Guidelines of 2007. Nesting eagle habitat exists throughout the park and nest locations may change over time. Therefore, this minimum altitude restriction extends uniformly to all routes of the park. Additionally, this provision will improve preservation of wilderness character and visitor experiences on the ground by reducing the intensity of air tour noise to visitors on the ground. This measure will also avoid or minimize potential effects on other avian species by reducing the noise intensity of air tour events in the areas nearest the routes. Operating, training, and education, which is also part of this ATMP, facilitates effective implementation of the plan by offering opportunities for the operator to remain informed regarding requirements of the ATMP. The annual meeting will also be used to review and discuss the implementation of the air tour management plan to ensure the operator is continually aware of the terms and conditions and is also made aware of new or recurring concerns the park may have. And with that, I think I can pass it back to Keith Lusk for the next slide.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Sabrina. Appreciate that detailed information on the plan as well as the park. As we mentioned earlier, the agencies need to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act. The development of this air tour management plan is considered a federal action subject to environmental review. The National Environmental Policy Act requires agencies to consider the effects of the action. In this case, the action is the air tour management plan itself and all the operating parameters associated with those tours. And we need to consider the effects of the plan on the human and natural environment. We also need to determine the appropriate level of environmental review. Basically, there's kind of 3 tiers of environmental review under NEPA. There's actions that are considered categorically excluded, And then in terms of environmental analysis and documentation, there are processes for environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. We're also going to be preparing associated environmental review documents as part of the ATMP process, and it's a requirement of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act as well, specifically. At this time, the agencies are considering developing this air tour management plan at Everglades under a National Park Service categorical exclusion. However, the agencies will be considering public comments on the ATMP. So again, we really are requesting that you do provide comments during this open comment period for us to consider in the development of the plan. And we're also going to be obviously including information that we obtain during consultation process. And we're going to fully assess the environmental impacts before making a final decision on the appropriate level of environmental review. Now, in addition to compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, there are a couple of special purpose laws that we're also required as federal agencies to comply with for this federal action. One of them is the National Historic Preservation Act, and the other one is the Endangered Species Act. Next slide, please. So the agencies are currently working to complete Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and that really requires us to coordinate with the various stakeholders, including Native American tribes, other stakeholders in the area, and we have to initially define what the undertaking is. In this case, it's the development of the air tour management plan, and we need to identify the participants. We've identified who the stakeholders are. We've been reaching out to those folks and coordinating with them. We also need to determine the area of potential effect. Basically, that's kind of the geographic area in which we think that any potential impacts or effects from the air tours would be contained within. And we also need to identify the historic properties. Next, we make an assessment of the effects of the plan on the historic properties, and then we resolve adverse effects, if there are any, to those historic properties. Again, as I mentioned, we have initiated the consultation with State Historic Preservation Office for Florida, as well as 4 tribes in the area with historic affiliation to these lands and other consulting parties. With that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Great, thank you, Keith. So the FAA and the National Park Service are complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, as they develop the draft ATMP. This will ensure that the proposed action does not jeopardize the existence of any species listed under ESA or result in destruction or adverse modification of designated critical habitat. So as you'll see on the slide there are 47 threatened or endangered species in the area, but the wood stork is the primary species that could be potentially affected by the ATMP. So the agencies have begun early consultation or coordination with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And at this point, we anticipate a determination of may affect, but not likely to adversely affect the wood stork. Next slide, please. So as noted earlier, we are currently inviting comment from the public, tribes, other agencies, and all interested parties on the draft that we have posted, and comments must be received by August 28th. Those comments can either be submitted online through the NPS public comment website that we mentioned earlier, or by mail to the address you see on the screen. You'll also see the link to the Pepsi site on the screen. The mailing address, just FYI, will also be on the Pepsi website. So if you don't capture it today, it is still out there publicly available. I also wanted to let you know that there's a FAQ document posted on the parks website along with the draft ATMP, and it's worth checking out. If somebody can, from the FAA, please drop a link to the Pepsi page into the social media platforms right now, I think it'd be helpful. Next slide, please. Following the end of the comment period, FAA and the National Park Service will review all of the comments and will use them to inform the final ATMP. We'll continue to coordinate and complete the tribal Section 106 and Section 7 consultations. And then we'll conclude the NEPA process by signing a decision document. Once all of this is wrapped up, the ATMPs will be considered complete and they'll be available on both the National Park Service and the FAA's websites. And to wrap it up, the FAA will then update the operations specifications for each air tour operator. Next slide, please. Okay, and then with that, I'd like to say thank you to all of our presenters. We're going to now turn into the Q&A portion of our meeting. And for anybody that may have joined during the presentations, I'm Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm the moderator of the meeting this evening. And if you have a question you want to submit, you can post it into a Google form. The link has been shared by FAA in the chat area of the social media platform you're using. So the chat area of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. And as a reminder, the questions that are submitted today will be considered by the agencies as they continue developing the ATMPs, but they're not actually official comments. The formal comments must be actually submitted through that Pepsi page I mentioned earlier, or sent to the mailing addresses that we've shared through the presentation and also on that website. You can see it again here on the slide. And one more reminder that the comments must be submitted by August 28th. As I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we're planning to hold this for 90 minutes and plan to adjourn around 8 p.m. Eastern time. In the event that we have questions addressed before that end time, we plan to continue to hold the meeting until 8 o'clock just to allow additional questions to filter in, like give people time to think about what they've heard during the presentations. And so we'll go through the Q&A. It looks like we have several questions that have come in. So we'll go through the Q&A, and then if we get to the end, we'll go off camera and off mic for a little bit just to let people think. And we'll be around until the end to talk through the questions. So going over here to the questions, this first one we'll give to Vicki with the National Park Service. Is this public meeting a requirement for an EIS or an EA? And can you please explain how NEPA is being done?
Sure, Michelle, and thanks for the question. Yeah, the public meeting is actually a requirement under the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. And so we are developing this, or considering developing the ATMP under an NPS categorical exclusion. And I'm going to read the numbers, so just give me a second here so I can read it off correctly. That is categorical exclusion 3.3A1 under the National Park Service Environmental Policy Handbook. And this is a CE that's defined as allowing changes or amendments to an approved action when such changes would cause no or only minimal environmental impact. And because the proposed action is very similar to existing air tour operations and includes new operating parameters with the routes and altitudes, impacts resulting from effects of the proposed action would result in no or only minimal environmental impacts. In addition, the inclusion of new operating parameters, such as the quiet technology incentives and the time of day restrictions, would ensure that the park would only experience beneficial impacts to the environment compared to current conditions. However, we are still in a draft process right now for the air tour management plan, and we will consider the comments on the air tour management plan, information obtained during consultations, and fully assess the environmental impacts before making the final determination on what NEPA pathway is appropriate. And just going back to that approved action, the interim operating authority that was granted by FAA and that was required by Congress is the approved action that we're looking at for the CE.
Great. Thanks, Vicki. Okay, this next question is for Keith with FAA. A few similar questions have been received relating to like what an ATMP covers. So we're going to put all of these together. It is, what is an air tour? Does the plan apply to all planes over national parks? And can general passenger planes fly over national parks? If you need me to repeat any of those, let me know.
No, thank you. All good questions. I know in some of the previous slides, I tried to touch on that a bit as to what an air tour management plan does or does not apply to, and kind of the definition of a commercial air tour. But I think it's important to kind of reiterate and highlight so folks' expectations about what we can or can't control under this air tour management plan are understood. So basically a commercial air tour is defined under FAA regulations, and it's basically an air tour that's conducted for compensation or hire in a powered aircraft for purposes of sightseeing over a national park unit within a half-mile boundary of the park or over the park. And again, in that airspace from 0 to 5,000 feet above ground level. There are exclusions for purposes of takeoff or landing, as well as for the necessary safe operation of the flight by the pilot in charge. And Michelle, remind me, I think the other one was about, would passenger carrying planes be regulated under this air tour management plan? Was that the other one?
Yeah, that was it.
Okay. Yeah, any commercially scheduled service or anything like that would not be considered a commercial air tour. These are strictly commercial air tours, not general aviation, commercial airline activity. Certainly not any military flights would be covered through this plan.
Great, thanks, Keith, and good job remembering all of those pieces. So the next question that we had come in is about drones, and they're asking if, does this apply to drones too? And I can just state briefly that the ATMP does not cover drones. And it's important to note that launching, landing, or any operation of unmanned aircraft, which are drones from national park lands, is prohibited. But thanks for that question. Looking through a couple more that we have, go ahead and see if Vicki wants to take a stab at this next question. It is, how many charter flights are happening now over Everglades National Park and the Florida Bay?
Okay, well, charter flights are not covered under the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, so we don't have any numbers on how many charter flights are happening. However, we do get air tour reports on the commercial air tours that are happening. And so for Everglades National Park, for the last 3 years, the average has been 64 tours per year. And we do have reports for all the parks that are on the National Park, Natural Sounds and Night Skies website for other folks who are interested in how many air tours are happening over the national park system in general.
Thank you, Vicki. All right, back to Keith. The question is, who reviews and approves the application? Will the tribe members whose land you are flying over be part of the approval process?
So I'm not sure what they mean by the application, but let me just start with the air tour management plan that we're developing right now. There was one operator, as we mentioned, he's an existing operator. He was granted authority to conduct tours over the park since he had been flying from 2000 and before, in those years before the act came into effect, and he was granted interim operating authority. That was really the only requirement. It was kind of a not to exceed number that he could do annually. There was no associated routes or altitudes or time of day restrictions, anything like that. as part of the plan we're developing now, we're going to be putting that operator on defined routes, defined altitudes with some time of day considerations and other types of requirements. As part of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, as part of this ATMP development process, we're required to consult with tribes. We're also required to invite them to participate as a cooperating agency for purpose of compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act if the air tours are flying over tribal lands. Based on the route information we have for this operator, none of the tours that he are doing fly over tribal lands within the park or adjacent to the park. Now, if the question was about an application for a new entrant operator after we stand up the final air tour management plan, as I mentioned earlier, there is a process that would also be allowed when an air tour management plan is developed, that new entrants could come in after we've developed the air tour management plan. They could submit an application to the agencies saying, hey, we would like to fly over Everglades as well. The agencies would review that plan, but as part of that process, if we went forward with that, it would go out for public review. We would coordinate with the tribes. Obviously, we would be taking tribal views and issues into consideration as part of that process. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Keith. And the next one's for, I think, Vicki. The question is, does the current draft ATMP apply to privately owned fixed-wing aircraft or just charter / excursion / tour operators?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thanks for that question. As noted by Keith earlier, the air tour management plan only applies to commercial air tours that are conducted for compensation or hire in a powered aircraft, and that's for sightseeing over a national park. So it does not apply to privately owned fixed-wing aircraft. That if somebody's just out just flying on their own, that would not, this air tour plan does not apply to that.
Thanks, Vicki. And Keith, what is the consequence for an aircraft not following the guidelines? For example, flying too low or outside of the time restrictions?
So thank you. That's also another good question. There are enforcement and compliance requirements that are put into the air tour management plan that we did develop. On the effective date of the air tour management plan, the commercial air tour operators must comply with the terms of that air tour management plan. It would be included in their operations specifications. Both agencies would be responsible for monitoring the oversight of the operator to make sure that they are complying with the terms and requirements of the plan. Our local Federal Aviation Flight Standards District Office in Southern Florida would have geographic oversight over those operations flying over the park. The FSDO would investigate any reports of non-compliance. The public may also report allegations of non-compliance to the FAA, and they may result ultimately in the partial or total loss of authorization to conduct commercial air tours under this ATMP. We have a FAA Order 2150.3 called FAA Compliance Enforcement Program that covers this. There's detailed processes and steps. We start with education if it was an error or an oversight on the operator's part. If it continues to be a problem, the compliance efforts increase incrementally with that. There's also requirements under this plan for the operator to have flight monitoring technology that would provide the agencies with data of where and how the tours were conducted, so we could ensure that if there were any issues associated with incident or a flight, that we would have some real data as to how that flight was conducted, and we'd be able to follow up and ensure that it was conducted in accordance with the plan. And if not, we would look to education, enforcement, and compliance.
Michelle, you're on mute.
Well, thank you for that. It's my first snafu of the evening. Thank you all for bearing with me. So Vicki, the question is for you. And the question is, if you will allow the exact number of flights that are currently occurring, does this mean you do not intend to have more than one operator? I'm wondering about competition and monopoly, but more about customers being able to find an operator that can interpret the resources of Everglades National Park better than a current operator.
Yeah, those are good questions. And so I can see the question in writing here. So if you see me looking to the side, I'm trying to make sure I get all the things answered that are in that couple questions there. So this draft air tour management applies just to the existing commercial air tours. And there was only one applicant, one existing air tour operator at the time the act was passed. And so this air tour plan is just going to apply to that one existing air tour operator. Now, there is a process and a mechanism in the PATMA for new entrants to apply, but they have to apply and be granted operating authority before they could actually fly in the areas that are covered by the air tour management plan. And so any subsequent, new operators would have to apply. They would have to submit information that the NPS and the FAA will require for that new entrant application. And there is a review process to jointly review any new entrant applications that came in and decide if that should be approved. So with this air tour management planning process, and I don't believe there have been any new entrant applications submitted, but if they were submitted prior to the date of this completion of the air tour management plan, those would be reviewed. However, anything that's submitted after the establishment of the air tour management plan will be considered no less frequently than every 3 years from the effective date of the air tour management plan. And this is a process that will be included in the air tour management plan, so the information will be available. So I think that covers the question about the intending to have more than one operator. And basically, I mean, the competition is really going to be dependent on what the number of operators out there that might be interested in doing air tours over Everglades. But like I said, there is a process for applying and then a review and approval process involved in order to, before they could start. So the next part of it was customers being able to find an operator that can interpret the resources of Everglades National Park. So the air tour management plan does contain a provision for training to be made available to the operator by park staff. And this would involve about one training course per year that's conducted by the park staff. And that training would include park information that the operator could use to further their own understanding of park priorities and management objectives, as well as to enhance the interpretive narrative they're offering to their air tour clients, and which would help increase understanding of parks by air tour clients. So I hope that answered that group of questions. There are a lot of things being asked there. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. And to those of you that are listening in, if at any point like one part of your question needs clarification, feel free to keep adding them into the chat. So let's see. The next question will go back to Keith. And the question is, was an offshore route outside of the park boundary considered so there would be no impacts to the wilderness, and so that the tour operator could proudly advertise his tours as totally zero impact and would protect all the environment and species, including humans visiting the solitude of the park?
So I'm not sure how far offshore the questioner was looking to go, but obviously the plan, as we indicated, really extends only to the park boundary and a half mile outside that, and that is the jurisdiction of the Air Tour Management Plan. As Adam mentioned when he was showing the map earlier, up in the northwest quadrant of Everglades Park, Everglades Airport is where this air tour operator conducts his tours from. That's where he takes off and lands. And essentially when he takes off, he's already pretty much over the park. And when he lands, he's coming in over the park as well. I would also note that the act, the objectives are to protect park resources, but it's also to allow, where appropriate, air tour operations to occur for visitors to see the park in another way. These routes that were provided by the air tour operator is what he is currently doing. We're reviewing those. We're getting input through the consultation process with tribes and other stakeholders through the 106 process. We're working with the Fish and Wildlife Service on any Endangered Species Act issues associated with these routes and this plan. We're also working with the public at large through this venue tonight, getting questions through the NPS Pepsi site, which will be up and available for folks to submit comments, which please submit your comments like these, and we will take a look at those and consider those before we finalize the air tour management plan.
Great, thanks, Keith. So it looks like we have a couple more questions that are trickling in. I don't see all of them quite yet. So I'm gonna give it a minute or two to allow folks to continue typing their questions into the chat. I just wanted to really reiterate what we heard earlier from both the FAA and Deputy Superintendent Diaz. The agencies really are genuinely interested in hearing from you. So please don't be shy about asking questions. We set aside this time to have this conversation, to be able to try to clarify things. So please continue to submit your questions into the chat areas of all of the social media platforms that you're using. And as we give those of you who are thinking about your questions right now a few minutes to think through what those questions might be, I'm going to go off camera and go on mute, but I just want to assure you that we are still here. We're monitoring the chat, and as soon as folks have a chance to get their questions typed in, we'll come back on and be sure to answer them. So we'll talk to you here in a couple minutes. Okay. We have a NEPA related question that just came in. And we'll throw this one over to Vicky. And the question is asking about what was the rationale for considering this as a categorical exclusion.
Okay, yeah, thanks again for that question. Yeah, well, as we mentioned earlier, we're proposing to use NPS categorical exclusion 3.3A1, which is from the NPS National Environmental Policy and Handbook. And this is the one that allows for changes or amendments to an approved action when that change would cause only no or minimal environmental impact. So we are completing an analysis of effects consistent with NEPA, and the type of documentation that is most appropriate to the analysis will be informed by the feedback we're receiving during this public review period on the ATMP to identify if additional effects not yet analyzed or identified exist, and whether or not there's the potential for adverse impacts that would make a different NEPA pathway more appropriate, such as an environmental assessment instead of a documented categorical exclusion. So we are considering the public comments on the ATMP. We're considering information obtained during consultations, and we'll fully assess the environmental impacts before making the final determination on what NEPA pathway is appropriate. And for just a reminder too, that a categorical exclusion doesn't mean it's excluded from NEPA, it just means it's excluded from preparing an environmental impact statement.
Great, thanks, Vicky. All right, so we have another question here. Good question. What AGL, what altitude or AGL would be required so that the noise footprint from the aircraft would not enter the designated wilderness area and would not be heard by park users that are underneath the flight path? And that's a really good question. I'm actually going to have to say that it's a little bit more of a technical question, and we may need to do a little bit more research to get a thorough response to that. But we have contact information for the questions, and we can follow up with you directly on that. So thank you for that question. Okay. And I'm going to go off camera for another minute or two to check to see the questions that are filtering in, and we'll be back here shortly. Okay. The questions are slow coming in. Just wanted to again reiterate, like please submit anything that you can think of. Like we're here to be able to answer your questions to the best of our ability. So please keep them coming in. We did just have one that seems like it would be best for Keith. The question is, how specifically is monitoring done, and who will do it as to number of overflights, altitude, and the routes flown?
Another good question. Touched a little bit on this earlier on our enforcement and compliance question. Currently, the agencies get reporting information that the operators are required to submit. This was one of the 2012 amendment provisions. Prior to that, we didn't really have any real-time reporting information from the operator. So currently there is a requirement. We've had this information for the last 8+ years that the operators are required to submit to the FAA and the Park Service every time they do an air tour with the date, the time, the aircraft that they were flying in. So really the follow-up for enforcement was based on, folks at the park or someone in the public saying, hey, I saw a low-flying aircraft that might have been an air tour. It seemed to be flying over the park in not the areas where it should be. Now with this plan, one of the requirements we're going to have is basically we're going to require equipage on all aircraft that are covered by the operators under this air tour management plan, that they would have flight monitoring technology and they would need to be used during all the air tours that they conduct over the parks. That would also be a reporting requirement to the agency. So they would submit that data concurrently with their semi-annual reports on the number of tours they do. So we're basically automating the process. We're providing them with kind of performance metrics that they need to meet in terms of, give us your lat long and your altitude at every 15-second intervals, or those are, I think they're called like ping rates, but there's commercial technology out there available, which basically provides all this data in some type of data file that they will submit to the agencies. We will then be able to review it and we can see where they were flying, how they were flying for each of their tours that are conducted over the park.
Great, thank you, Keith. Monitoring the question box. It looks like there's some typing happening. I don't know if we have anything completely coming in, so we'll give it once again another minute or two for you guys to think through some of the stuff that we've talked about tonight, think through some of the responses to the questions you've heard, and look forward to seeing some more questions come in. So go off here for a couple minutes, but we'll be on with you shortly. Okay. Um, we have another question that just came in. Is there a park entry fee for the tour operator, and how is entry monitored? And I'm going to see if Vicky would be willing to take a stab at that one.
Sure, Michelle. Yes, there are air tour fees authorized, but only at a couple parks right now. And air tour fees were authorized back in 1993 under the Omnibus Reconciliation Act. And so that allowed the Park Service to start collecting air tour fees for aircraft operating tours in airspace over certain parks. And based on the definitions in that legislation, we're currently collecting fees for air tours over Grand Canyon National Park, Haleakala National Park, and Hawaii Volcanoes National Parks, but not Everglades or not any of the other air tour planned parks that we're working on. And so I guess the second part of that question is, and how is entry monitored? For those other parks, it is based on self-reporting by the operators. Under this air tour management plan and under the future air tour management plans established, there is a flight tracking requirement that we will have implemented so we can get some flight tracking data from operators to monitor that. And then in addition, we do have self-reporting currently for operators who are flying under interim operating authority to report the number of flights that they're doing over parks.
Thanks again, Vicky. Looks like we have about 10 minutes left. Albeit slow, there are some questions that are still trickling in. So we are gonna give you guys a few more minutes to keep thinking and keep submitting questions. And in the meantime, as I've said before, and I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, we're gonna go off camera and off mic, but we will be here watching the questions come in. So stay tuned and we'll be back on here in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay. So we have a follow-up question that came in to the one that Keith responded to a little bit earlier about monitoring requirements. And it is asking, what is the specific technology that will be required, and will it replace the voluntary reporting?
So I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that there's various technologies, commercial applications out there. Basically, what the agencies have done is just set the performance requirements, the performance standards that this data needs to provide to us for reporting purposes. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of give us your lat long, give us your altitude, and do that at every 15-second intervals along the route when you're conducting a tour over a national park unit. Part of the development of that language and those requirements was, in an association with some conversation we had with some of the folks on the air tour operator side of the house, as well as through some folks on our National Parks Overflight Advisory Group Committee. And I think there was a part of the question is, will it replace voluntary reporting? First of all, reporting was not voluntary. It is a requirement. It's been a requirement since 2013. And no, this is supplemental information. We will still require them to report semi-annually. And that's basically the number of tours that they've conducted, the date and time of those operations, et cetera. Thank you.
I caught myself. I did the mute thing again. Thank you very much for that, Keith. So we have a question, and we'll bring a new voice on. I think this time we'll have Adam take a shot, and if others want to chime in for clarification, you can come on camera. But the question is, the draft ATMP does not mention the word decibels, although this is the basic unit for measuring sound and the sound impacts. Why is there no analysis of decibel/sound impacts on the natural soundscapes of the wilderness in the Everglades draft plan? And is the park willing to install acoustic monitoring units to develop baseline acoustic data in areas where the routes are proposed before any action is taken?
Thanks, Michelle. So we do have baseline ambient data for Everglades National Park, and we took that data in 2008 and 2009. And there's a report by Liam McDonald that was published in 2016 that answers the question about what the baseline is. That baseline data was included in noise analysis that informed this ATMP. So we have conducted some noise analysis to help understand the noise impacts. And while that's not presented specifically in the ATMP, because ATMP is more about the plan rather than the noise impacts, that noise analysis will be included in NEPA documentation.
Great, thanks, Adam. Not close to the end. Let me, I'm going to double check see if anything else is trickling in here really quick, and we'll see if we have one or two more questions. So we'll be back in just a second. Okay, so looks like we have one final question here that we'll get to before wrapping up for this evening. And I think Keith is going to be an appropriate person to answer this. So the question was, how was the IOA of 674 arrived at? And the questioner was asking about this possibly being a fraudulent number.
Fraudulent number, did you say?
Yeah.
Okay, so how it was arrived at, basically it's in the National Parks Air Tour Management Act. This operator would be considered an existing operator. They were flying pre-2000, before enactment of the act. The requirement was that they would report to the FAA the number of flights that they were doing annually pre-2000. That number looks like the operator submitted was 674. That was before my time and a lot of folks here on this call's time. I have no evidence or have not heard any issues with that number specifically, that it was fraudulent or not the correct number. So we, that is the number. That's the number that they have been flying at or allowed to fly up to for these intervening years up until now. We know that based on the reporting data, the numbers of late have been well below that. But ultimately, it really doesn't matter because interim operating authority goes away when an air tour management plan is developed, which is what the end goal of this process is going to be. And the operator will be granted operating authority. So really that interim operating number of 674 really doesn't have a basis right now. We have more recent information. We're going through consultation, taking public comments. So I think we've moved past IOA, I guess would be the way to put it. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. And now we are here at the 8 o'clock hour, coming to the end of the meeting. I want to make sure that everybody does know there is that frequently asked questions document that I mentioned earlier, which is posted on the parks site with the draft ATMP, and there's some good Q&A on there. So please check it out. If for some reason you had a question that came in here at the end that we didn't have a chance to answer, you can reach out to Tatiana Marquez, the park planner. FAA is going to drop her phone number into the chat area of the platform that you're using. But if you happen to have a pen or typing really quick, her number is 305-242-7821. Again, that's 305-242-7821. So as a reminder, all of the questions, very good questions that we got this evening, they will be considered as the agencies continue drafting their ATMPs, but they're not like officially formal comments. All of those official formal comments must go through the Pepsi environment and public comment site or sent to the mailing address. And you'll see both of those listed on the slide that's displayed here. And one final reminder, those comments must be received by August 28th of 2021. Thank you again for your participation on behalf of both the FAA and the National Park Service. We do look forward to hearing from you and seeing your comments, and we hope you all have a good rest of your evening. Take care.